Orleans in the early 1830s was a city of silk gowns and chandeliers, a place where carriages rolled across cobbled streets, where French Creole music poured out of balconies and the perfume of gumbo and roasted meat floated through the humid air. But behind the walls of these glittering mansions, behind the laughter of grand balls and the polished shoes of politicians, merchants and slave traders, there was another city hidden in the shadows. It was the city of the enslaved, men and women who cooked the food, who scrubbed the floors, who built the very foundations of the houses, yet were treated as less than human. In the grand kitchen of the LaRue household, flames from the wood stove painted the walls with smoke violet. Bent over heavy pots, her hands raw from endless labor, her body tired but her mind awake, she had been born into bondage. She had never known freedom yet. She had learned that the kitchen was more than a prison. It was also a place of power. Each spice, each herb, each root carried secrets. Some could heal the body, others could weaken it, and some could destroy it completely. Violet watched closely every time she was sent to the market. She memorized the colors and textures of the plants that the swamp women whispered about. She noticed how one leaf when crushed smelled sharp and bitter, how another root when boiled turned the water dark and cloudy. She did not speak of it to anyone, but deep inside her, she understood that food was not just survival. It was also a weapon in a city where her body was owned and her fate decided by others. She clung to this knowledge like a hidden blade. The guests in the LaRue home would lift their glasses and praise the delicate stews, the fine breads, the sweet puddings. None of them ever looked into the eyes of the young woman who stirred the pots. They did not see the anger simmering in her chest. They did not hear the silent vow she made each night when she lay down on the hard floor of the servants' quarters, a vow that one day the same hands that fed them would turn the feast into their downfall. And so Violet continued to serve. She smiled when ordered. She bowed her head when struck. But in her heart, she was waiting for the moment when the kitchen that had chained her would also give her the fire of revenge. The mansion was large, its white walls gleaming under the Louisiana sun, and inside it echoed with voices of masters and mistresses who believed themselves kings and queens of a world built on chains. But deep in the belly of this house, in the wide and smoky kitchen, labored Violet, a young enslaved woman whose life had been measured not in years, but in chores and bruises, in the orders barked at her from dawn until the oil lamps flickered out at night. She had known no freedom since her first breath. She had been born into this bondage, her mother before her. And now Violet stood at the iron stove, lifting heavy pots, stirring stews, slicing meat with hands that shook not from weakness but from exhaustion. Every morning before the roosters called, she was shaken awake by the older women who worked beside her. They whispered prayers in tongues older than this land, voices cracked by time and sorrow. Violet listened, though she never repeated the words aloud, because her heart was already heavy, and she feared that if she gave those prayers breath, she might break and never rise again. So she worked. She obeyed, and she learned silently. Every move, every smell, every color that passed before her eyes became a lesson, because Violet had discovered that knowledge, even when it could not set her free, could still give her something else. Something dangerous. The kitchen was her cage, but also her classroom. Pots boiled with shrimp, crawfish, and onions, the air heavy with pepper, garlic, and thyme. But Violet knew that the same swamps that gave herbs for flavor also held secrets far darker. When she was sent out to the markets, when she carried baskets through the muddy edges of town, she would sometimes drift to the borders where swamp women bent low to gather roots, their hands stained with earth and water. She listened as they whispered of leaves that healed fever, roots that soothed pain, and powders that brought sleep, a deep sleep that ended with death. Violet remembered each word she memorized, the shapes, the smells, the textures. She hid the images in her mind as carefully as she would later hide something else. As days became weeks and weeks became years, she began to understand that the plants themselves held a language one. No master could read when Violet ground a certain leaf between her fingers. She could feel the bitterness seep into her skin when she boiled another root in secret. Just to test it, the water grew black and the rats that scurried through the cellar dropped silently. Their tiny bodies curled stiff as dried twigs. She had not meant to kill them. At first it had been curiosity, but when she saw them lying there, something in her chest shifted. Not fear, not pity, but something colder and sharper, a thought that perhaps the power she could never find in her own life existed in these hidden powders. The other servants never noticed when Violet tucked away small handfuls of roots, when she crushed them quietly in a corner at night, when she folded the fine dust into a piece of cloth and tied it shut. She kept the pouch pressed against her skin beneath her apron, always hidden, always close. It gave her a strange comfort, as though she were no longer entirely powerless, as though within the folds of her rough dress she carried not only roots, but her own secret fate. Every day as she moved about the kitchen, her mistress Madame Leroux would enter, sweeping her skirts across the floor, her tongue sharp, her eyes colder than the silver cutlery she handled, and when the food displeased her, Violet bore the punishment a hand across her cheek, or worse, a scalding ladle pressed close enough to burn. Yet Violet never cried aloud. She never looked away. She simply bowed her head and thought of the pouch beneath her apron, the crushed roots lying quietly like sleeping embers, waiting for breath to awaken them. The master's guests would come in waves, senators, merchants, slave traders, fat and laughing their bellies, eager for food, their mouths wet with wine, and none of them noticed the girl who moved silently among the pots. None of them noticed the sweat on her brow or the fire in her eyes. They never asked her name to them. She was nothing but hands that cooked, feet that ran, ears that heard commands, but Violet was not empty inside. She was not silent inside in her heart. A storm brewed, and with each meal she served, with each plate she placed before her masters, that storm grew stronger. Sometimes at night she would lie on the wooden floor staring into the darkness, her fingers brushing the pouch, and she would ask herself why she kept it. Was it only for comfort? Was it only to feel some kind of control? Or was it already a decision made in the silence of her own mind? She did not yet know. She only knew that she could not part with it, that she needed it near her, the way others needed prayer or song, because within that small bundle of roots, Violet carried her only weapon, her only secret, her only chance to turn the kitchen that enslaved her into the place where her vengeance would one day rise. And so the days continued, Violet bending over the flames, her apron hiding the pouch, her eyes hiding the fire, and the question whispered through her soul louder each night. Why does she keep it? Why does she feed it with new roots, with powders, with herbs? Is it for survival, or is it for revenge? Madame Leroux was a woman carved from cruelty. Her presence filled the kitchen like smoke, choking every breath her voice struck. Like a whip, sharp and unrelenting, her footsteps echoed on the wooden floors, and whenever Violet heard them, her stomach clenched because she knew pain was near. The mistress carried herself with the pride of a queen, yet she ruled her household. With fire and fear, she was infamous not only among the slaves, but even whispered about by the neighbors. They said her temper was like a storm, sudden and merciless, and Violet knew this better than anyone. For Violet, the burns on her hands were proof, the blistered skin a map of suffering. Each scar carried the memory of a moment when a pot was not stirred quickly enough, or when the bread browned too dark, or when a plate arrived seconds too late to the dining hall. Each mistake was answered by Madame Leroux with a punishment. She favored the hot pans lifted straight from the fire, pressed against Violet's palms until the smell of seared flesh filled the air, and Violet's body shook but her lips remained closed. She had learned long ago that crying only fueled the mistress's satisfaction. Silence became her shield, though silence never softened the agony. The wealthy guests never saw this side of the house when they entered. They were dazzled by chandeliers, by golden cutlery, by dishes of gumbo jambalaya and sweet beignets that seemed to melt on the tongue. They laughed, they toasted, they raised glasses to fortune and power. They licked their lips and spoke of the brilliance of the LaRue table. None of them asked who, bent over the stove, none of them cared whose tears had fallen into the broth or whose blood had been wiped from the cutting board they ate. And they praised, and they left with full bellies and light hearts, while Violet remained in the kitchen, hands throbbing, body trembling, eyes burning with rage she could not show. The cruelest part was how Madame LaRue smiled when praised, how she tilted her head and accepted compliments for flavors she did not create, for meals she never touched, for recipes she could not even read. It was Violet who carried the knowledge, Violet who mixed the spices, who balanced salt with smoke, who turned bitter greens into velvet on the tongue. Yet Madame LaRue stood in the light while Violet remained in the shadow, scars hidden under sleeves. The mistress admired for genius she did not possess, and Violet remembered each word, each smile, each nod, and tucked it into the same dark corner of her soul, where her secret pouch of crushed roots lay waiting. Sometimes, when the dining hall grew loud with laughter, Violet would linger at the doorway carrying a tray. She would watch the glasses being filled with deep red Bordeaux wine, the liquid glimmering like blood in the candlelight. Madame LaRue would lift her glass, her lips painted the color of ripe berries, her laughter sharp as glass, and Violet would stare, her eyes fixed on that wine. Not with envy, but with an imagining as vivid as flame. She pictured the glass trembling in the mistress's hand as her throat closed, as her laughter twisted into choking gasps. She pictured the color red, darkening, not from grapes, but from something mixed, hidden, deadly. She did not move. She did not act. But the thought lived inside her, as real as breath sometimes. She felt her hand brush against her apron where the pouch rested warm against her skin, and she wondered if tonight could be the night, if she could scatter the powder into the wine. Before anyone noticed, if she could watch Madame LaRue fall silent in front of the very guests who praised her so. But then the moment would pass. The laughter would rise again. The glasses would clink, and Violet would retreat back into the kitchen, carrying the weight of her vision back into the shadows. Still, the thought never left her. It grew each day stronger, each night louder. It lived in her eyes whenever she stared at Madame LaRue. It curled in her chest whenever her scars throbbed with pain. It whispered in her dreams when she lay on the hard floor unable to rest. Violet could not banish it. She did not try to banish it because it gave her something no master could take. It gave her the taste of power. It gave her a reason to endure. It gave her vengeance, waiting like coals hidden under ash, waiting for the breath that would ignite them into flames. Oh, Violet worked, and Violet served, and Violet endured. But all the while her gaze lingered on the mistress's wine glass, as if her eyes alone could transform its sweetness into death, as if she could already taste the future in every drop. And though she remained silent, though her hands moved as commanded, though her lips spoke only yes ma'am and no ma'am, the truth pulsed inside her louder than the beating of her heart. One day this glass will not hold only Bordeaux. One day it will hold your end. The night in the LaRue mansion was never truly silent. The wind outside dragged itself through the swamp trees, moaning low and long. The floorboards creaked with the weight of history and footsteps. The rats in the cellar scratched and scurried in the dark, and in the kitchen where the ashes of the day's fire still glowed faint and red. Violet would often lie awake on the hard planks of the servants' quarters, her body aching, her mind restless, her eyes staring at the rafters above, and it was on such nights that whispers traveled across the room like smoke. The older kitchen women spoke softly, their voices hushed as though the walls themselves carried ears. They spoke of a secret too dangerous to say loudly, a secret passed from mother to daughter, from one enslaved woman to another over generations, a weapon hidden in plain sight. They called it the green powder. Violet lay perfectly still listening, her heart drumming against her ribs, her breath shallow. She had heard fragments before when she was younger, a mention of roots that grew half-hidden in the swamps, herbs gathered at night, when the moon was high, powders ground fine and folded into cloth as small as a coin. But now she heard the words clear. The women said it was the weapon of those who had nothing else. They said it came from plants whose leaves hid poison, whose roots carried death. They said a pinch of it mixed into a stew would not be tasted. A spoonful of it stirred into wine would not be noticed. The victim would eat and laugh and drink and sleep, but within days their body would betray them. The powder invisible and patient, creeping through blood and bone until it ended breath itself. The women's voices trembled with both fear and awe, because the green powder was not only poison, it was power. It was the only power left to those who had been stripped of everything. Violet's mind seized on the words. She felt as though a door had opened inside her, one she had been waiting for without knowing it. She remembered the pouch she already carried, the crushed roots she had gathered on her own, the experiments she had made in secret, and she wondered if, perhaps without realizing it, she had already been walking this path. She listened as the women warned that the powder must be used carefully, that if the wrong one saw the signs, if the masters suspected, the punishment would be death, not only for the one who used it, but for all who had known of it. Entire quarters burned, families, broken whips, tearing flesh, until silence returned. But Violet could not look away from the fire that sparked in her heart. She waited until the whispers died, until the women fell into uneasy sleep, and then she rose her steps, light, her body moving like shadow. She carried a small scrap of cloth in which she had hidden the powder. She had already begun to make her hands steady, though her heart thundered, and she slipped into the cellar, where the air smelled of mold and dust, and the sound of rats filled the darkness. She knelt close to the corner where the creatures darted, their eyes glinting faintly in the glow of her small candle. She scattered crumbs of bread soaked in a mixture she had made, the powder ground so fine it vanished into the food. The rats came quick, greedy, their teeth snapping, their tails flicking, and Violet crouched low, watching. She whispered no words, but her eyes stayed fixed on them, her breath still as stone, and slowly, one by one, their movements faltered. Their bodies stiffened, their squeals sharp and sudden. Before silence fell, Violet's chest swelled, not with joy, not with sorrow, but with a cold certainty. The powder worked night after night. She tested different amounts, different roots. Sometimes the rats writhed in pain for hours. Sometimes they dropped quickly. Sometimes they survived. And Violet took note. She memorized each change, each result she was becoming, both cook and chemist, both servant and master of death. The green powder was no longer just a whispered tale. It was real. It was in her hands. It was her secret. And with every rat that fell still, the thought grew louder in her mind. What if it were not rats but masters? What if it were not crumbs but wine? What if this power could turn her tears into vengeance? She tucked the pouch back beneath her apron, her fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what she now carried. She returned to her bed among the sleeping women, her face calm, her body still, but her heart alive with a fire she could not quench. And as she lay in the dark, listening to the distant croak of frogs and the restless scratching of rats, she knew that she was no longer just Violet, the kitchen slave. She was Violet, the keeper of poison. Violet, the watcher of wine glasses. Violet, the one who could change everything with a single pinch of green powder. And though no one else in that house knew, though no one else saw she felt the path stretching before her, endless and inevitable. The kitchen that had caged her was now her weapon. The swamp that had haunted her was now her teacher. The whispers of the old women were now her truth, and Violet understood, in the marrow of her bones, that her time was coming. Her chance was waiting, hidden in the shadows of the cellar and the silence of the night. The mansion yard was wide and filled with shadows. The horses stamped their hooves, restless in the humid night air, and Violet often walked past the stables carrying baskets of scraps to be thrown away. She rarely looked up, rarely spoke to anyone. Her world had been the kitchen and the cellar, the smoke and the sweat and the fire. But one night, when the moon was thin and silver, she caught the eyes of Jacob the coachman. His skin glistened with the labor of the day, his arms strong from handling reins and wheels, his back bent but his gaze unbroken. He looked at her, not as the masters did, not as the mistresses did, but as though he saw the storm hidden behind her silence. At first their words were few, nods exchanged in passing whispers, when no one else was near. Jacob was older, his face carved with lines of pain and endurance, his hands scarred from years of driving the carriages of men who spoke of liberty, while chaining others. Violet had heard rumors that Jacob once tried to run rumors, that he had been caught and whipped, until his back was a map of agony. Yet still he stood, still he moved, still he breathed, and in his eyes Violet saw something dangerous, something familiar, the same fire that lived inside her. Their first true conversation happened near the smokehouse where no one lingered. Violet had slipped away, her apron carrying the faint weight of her secret pouch. Jacob was there, sharpening a small knife meant for cutting harness leather. He did not look at her at first, only spoke low and steady, saying he had seen her in the cellar, seen her with the rats. He asked her why she scattered crumbs, why she watched them die. And Violet froze, her breath caught, because no one was supposed to know. No one was supposed to see. But Jacob did. He leaned closer, his voice still low, and said he knew about the green powder. He said the old man had whispered to him once too, that the swamp held plants that could topple kings. And he said he understood, because he had his own reasons, his own ghosts. Jacob had watched his brother sold south, never to return. Jacob had carried masters drunk in his carriage while they laughed about the women they broke. Jacob had stood silent while his own flesh and blood was whipped in the yard, and each time he swallowed his rage it carved deeper inside him until he carried it like stone. Violet listened, her eyes never leaving his, and she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt less alone. The secret that had weighed on her heart was no longer hers alone. Jacob carried it too. When she told him about the powder, the way it slid into food unseen, the way it waited patient in the body. Jacob nodded, not with fear, but with resolve. He said, one death was not enough. He said if they struck, they must strike with force. They must strike at the very heart of the house, at the very table where power feasted. They began to plan in whispers stolen in the dark corners of the yard, in the shadows of the kitchen door. In the hush of the stables, Violet told him she had enough powder to kill a man. Jacob told her she would need 10 times more. He said the LaRues were planning a banquet, a grand feast for senators, generals, traders, the very men who built their wealth on chains. Jacob's voice trembled not with fear but with hunger. He said, if they poisoned the banquet, it would not just kill a master. It would send a message. It would spread terror through every gilded house in New Orleans. Violet's heart pounded with the thought, the image of chandeliers shaking as men fell, choking, the image of wine glasses spilling, red across white linen like rivers of blood. But Jacob's face hardened and his voice cut through her vision. He warned her, he said, if one person survives, if even one man walks away, they will know it was us. They will hunt us. They will burn us. They will hang us from the trees and the others will suffer. Two Jacob's words were not to frighten her. They were to remind her that vengeance was not a game. It was fire. It consumed both master and slave alike. Still Violet could not turn away. From the idea, the banquet became a shadow in her mind. She stirred the pots by day and dreamed of poisoned feasts by night. She sharpened her knowledge, measuring doses, watching rats fall in silence. She mixed powders finer and finer until no eye could see, no tongue could taste. And Jacob gathered news of the guests, their numbers, their habits, their favorite wines and foods together. They pieced a plan dangerous and fragile, yet pulsing with the chance of freedom or death in the stillness of night when all else slept. Violet sat with Jacob in the shadows of the stable. He told her he did not fear dying if it meant striking a blow. He said he only feared being forgotten. Violet listened, her fingers brushing against the hidden pouch, and she whispered that if death came, at least it would come on her terms. At least it would not be the slow death of chains, but a death of fire, a death that would make them remember, and in the silence that followed the air thick with the scent of horses and earth, their pact was sealed, not with words alone, but with the burning weight of their shared fury, and so Violet was no longer alone. She carried the powder and Jacob carried the plan together. They carried the storm and the banquet that loomed ahead became not just a night of celebration for the masters, but the stage where Violet and Jacob would test the edge between survival and vengeance, between silence and rebellion, between death and legend. The night of the first test began like so many others, the kitchen alive with fire and steam. Violet moving among the pots, her body bent with labor, her mind sharp as the knives she used the house prepared for guests. The dining hall glowing with candlelight, the silver polished until it shone like mirrors, the air heavy with the smell of roasted duck and spiced soup. Violet's mistress barked orders, her voice a whip cracking through the air, and Violet bowed her head, answering, "Yes, ma'am," her voice calm though beneath her apron. Her heart pounded against the hidden pouch that carried the dust of death. She had thought of this moment for weeks, grinding the roots finer and finer until they were soft as breath, testing the measures on rats, counting the hours, watching the way their bodies twisted and stiffened. She knew now the exact touch, the smallest pinch that could strike without warning, that could slip unseen into the belly of the strongest man. And so when the soup pot bubbled and the kitchen bustled, Violet moved steady, her hand dipping her ladle into the broth, her eyes fixed on the swirling liquid, and with a motion no one noticed, she let fall a trace of green powder so small it vanished instantly, swallowed by the steam, by the pepper and thyme, by the layers of flavor none could untangle. The bowl was carried out on a tray, the guest a merchant wealthy and loud, his laughter filling the dining hall. He lifted the spoon with no suspicion. He ate with pleasure, licking the broth from his lips, praising Madame Leroux for her excellent table. Madame smiled, taking the words as her own as always, never glancing once at the girl who had prepared the dish. Violet stood in the doorway, her eyes lowered but her ears wide, her body stiff. She felt each second pass like a hammer striking. She wondered if the powder had taken hold, if the guest would falter, if anyone would see. Hours later the hall was quieter, the guests full of food and wine. The laughter softened to murmurs, and Violet had returned to the kitchen when the cry came, the merchant clutching his stomach, his face pale, sweat pouring down his forehead, his body bending with pain, his voice breaking in groans and curses, the other guests rising in alarm. Madame Leroux shrieking for help, the doctors summoned with haste, the room alive with chaos. Violet stood still, her hands wet from the wash basin, her eyes calm. The cries echoed through the house as the merchant stumbled, as his body convulsed, and Violet thought, "This is it. This is the moment. They will look at me. They will know." But the doctors came in their fine coats, their hands fumbling their words, rolling quickly. They spoke of oysters of shellfish, turned foul in the summer heat. They said the sickness was common. The river carried such dangers the merchant had been unlucky, but he would live and the others need not fear, and the guests sighed in relief, shaking their heads, clucking their tongues, blaming the market sellers, blaming the swamp, blaming anything but the hands of the quiet girl who stirred the soup. Violet watched her mistress clutch the merchant's hand, speaking words of comfort. Violet watched the guests drink more wine, their fear slipping away, their laughter returning to life, and in that moment, Violet felt a shift, a crack in the iron weight that had pressed upon her chest for years. No one suspected her, not a glance, not a whisper, not a question. The powder had done its work. The merchant had suffered. The house had trembled, and Violet had remained invisible. She turned her face to the kitchen fire, where the flames licked the blackened iron, where smoke curled into the dark, and for the first time in years her lips curved. Her mouth softened, her teeth bared in a smile. It was not joy, not the smile of a child, not the smile of comfort, but a sharp smile born of knowledge, born of power. It was the smile of a woman who had discovered her weapon and tested it, and seen that it worked. Violet smiled because she knew she held death in her hands, and no one, not even Madame Leroux with her cruel eyes and burning pans, could see it. She dried her hands on her apron, her scars rough beneath her fingertips. She lifted another pot and stirred the broth. Her face calm, her back bent like always, but inside, Violet stood taller than she ever had before. The house still echoed with the groans of the sick merchant. The guests still muttered about oysters and misfortune. But Violet knew the truth. She had poisoned a man, and the world had not ended. The world had not seen the act, and now the world would never see her the same way again. In the silence of the kitchen, she let the smile linger hidden in shadow, knowing it would not be her last, knowing this was only the beginning. This Leroux mansion was alive with preparation, weeks before the celebration began. The mistress stalked the halls, her skirts dragging across polished floors, her tongue striking at servants with endless commands. The master wrote letters sealed with wax, inviting senators and generals and merchants whose wealth was carved from chains and blood. Invitations flew across the city, until all of New Orleans whispered of the grand banquet to be held in the White House, with its glowing windows and chandeliers that never dimmed. The slaves scrubbed until their hands cracked the floors, until they reflected light the silver, until it gleamed like rivers. And in the kitchens, Violet worked, her body bent over endless pots, her mind bent on something else entirely. This was no ordinary feast. This was power gathered in one place. It was the men who owned ships, who commanded armies, who traded human lives like cattle. It was the women who wore silk and laughed with jeweled throats while others carried their burdens. Violet saw the names on the guest lists as she passed by tables where the mistress tossed them carelessly. She heard the conversations of the house, the pride in Madame Leroux's voice when she told neighbors of the glory that would shine within her walls, and Violet felt her chest thrum with fire. She saw her chance in every candle that would burn on that night, in every dish that would be carried to the long table. She saw her chance to turn celebration into ruins. He gathered with Jacob in the stables, their voices soft under the snorts of horses, Jacob's eyes sharp and shadowed. He told her the banquet would hold more than 50 guests, men guarded by slaves and overseers whose whips coiled at their sides. He told her the mansion would be alive with watchful eyes, and that if they struck the blow too strong, if even one person crawled away alive, the fury of New Orleans would rise against them. The city would burn with vengeance. They would not only hunt Violet and Jacob, they would punish every slave who had ever touched the house, every worker who had ever carried food across its halls. The price of their strike would not only be blood of the masters, but blood of their own. Violet listened, her hand pressed against the pouch of powder hidden at her waist. She thought of the years of scars on her palms, of the laughter in the dining hall, of the cries of the sick merchant who had never known she was the hand behind his. pain. She thought of Madame Leroux's voice when she called her dog, when she pressed hot iron to her skin. Violet felt the fury coil in her belly like a living thing, and though she heard Jacob's warning, she could not turn away from the vision of 50 glasses raised and 50 bodies collapsing under the weight of her vengeance. Yet Jacob's hesitation was heavy. He spoke of his brother sold south of the lashes on his back, of the friends who had vanished into the swamp when they tried to flee. He said he wanted vengeance, but he wanted freedom too. He said one could not taste freedom if vengeance brought only fire and death. Jacob said the masters would not forget such a strike. They would hunt with dogs, with guns, with gold. They would make the streets of New Orleans run with more chains than ever before. His words hung heavy in the stable air like smoke. Violet's eyes burned, but her mouth stayed silent. She had no answer for his fear, only the pounding in her chest that told her vengeance was already alive inside her. Each day, as the banquet drew nearer, the mansion became a hive of movement. Women sewing gowns, men hauling barrels of wine, cooks preparing meats that filled the cellars. Violet's hands worked without pause, but her mind walked forward into that night. She imagined the long table spread with food, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and she imagined her hands slipping the powder into the pots, into the pitchers, into the wine. She imagined the silence that would follow the groans, the gasps, the collapse of power itself at her feet. But at night, when she returned to the shadows, when she sat with Jacob in the stillness, he looked at her with eyes that held both fury and fear. He told her again, if one person survives, they will know it was us. He said it, like a curse, like a prophecy, and Violet carried the weight of his words back to her bed, where she lay staring into the dark, the pouch warm against her skin, the future heavy on her shoulders. The night of the banquet loomed large. Violet felt it breathing at the edges of every day. And though Jacob hesitated, though his voice wavered with warning, Violet knew in the marrow of her bones that the path was already chosen. The powder would not stay hidden forever. It was meant for the feast. It was meant for the masters. It was meant for the night when laughter would turn to screams and silence would fall heavy over the Leroux mansion. The night of the banquet came heavy with heat, and the sky above New Orleans glowed with lanterns and smoke. The Leroux mansion shimmered with candlelight, and music poured from its halls, violins crying sweet while voices laughed sharp. The great doors opened and the guests swept in. Senators in silk coats, generals with medals gleaming, slave traders with fat bellies and jeweled hands, their wives in gowns that shimmered like rivers of gold. They filled the dining hall, their words booming of wealth, of power, of land, while their boots struck the wooden floors like drums, and behind the curtains in the shadows the servants moved like ghosts, unseen, unheard, but carrying the weight of the feast. Violet stood at the stove, her hands steady, her heart silent, her eyes colder than the fire beneath. The pots she ladled the stew into golden bowls, the rich broth thick with meat and spice, the scent heavy with pepper and thyme, and in each bowl she poured not only food but fate. Her fingers had scattered the powder so fine, so invisible no eye could see, no tongue could taste it, melted into the heat, dissolved into the flavor, until it became one with the dish. She moved with calm precision, bowl after bowl, filled, placed on trays, carried into the glittering hall, where laughter rang like bells. The guests lifted glasses of red wine, toasting to the wealth of Louisiana, to the strength of their armies, to the future of empire. They drank deep, never tasting the doom hidden in the food. Before them, Violet watched from the doorway, her back, bent, her head lowered, but her eyes sharp as blades. She saw the smiles. She saw the glint of rings. She saw the mistress, Madame Leroux, seated proud at the head of the table. Her voice loud, her laugh piercing. Violet saw her raise her glass and drink, and for a moment the world narrowed to that sight. But then Violet's eyes shifted and she froze, for at the far end of the table among the golden plates and shining silver sat the mistress's daughter, a child, no older than 8, her curls tied, with ribbons, her small hands clutching the spoon. She dipped it into the stew and lifted it, her lips soft, her eyes bright. Innocent Violet's chest tightened, a storm rising inside her. She had not thought of this. She had not planned for this. She had seen vengeance in the faces of men and women who deserved the fire. But now here sat a child untouched by cruelty, too young to carry the weight of her mother's sins, and Violet's hand trembled just once beneath her apron as she watched. Jacob's words rang in her ears. "If one person survives, they will know it was us." His warning lived heavy in her mind. Yet another voice whispered deep inside her, the voice of years of pain, years of scars, years of laughter at her suffering. The voice that said vengeance makes no room for innocence. The powder does not choose who eats it. The powder takes all the same. Violet stood between the two voices, her heart torn, her eyes fixed on the child's small mouth opening to take the first bite time. Slowed the hall alive with laughter, with music, with the clatter of forks and knives. But in Violet's world there was only the child, the spoon, the stew. The fate hidden within Violet's body felt split. Her fury, burning her pity, pulling her thoughts, twisting like vines in the swamp. But her face remained calm, her hands steady. She moved another tray. She carried another dish, and no one saw the storm that roared inside her. The child ate her spoonful, the broth sliding down her throat, and Violet's breath caught in her chest. She could not look away. She could not breathe. She could not decide whether to feel triumph or dread. Her vengeance was alive now, coursing through the veins of senators, of generals, of merchants, of her mistress, and perhaps of the child as well, and Violet knew the path she had chosen, allowed no returns. Still she lingered at the doorway, her eyes heavy, her lips pressed tight as though she were holding back a scream. The guests raised their glasses again, toasting louder, their voices ringing in victory, not knowing that death itself sat among them, that poison shared their table, that vengeance breathed through their laughter. And Violet's gaze flickered once more to the child who licked her spoon and smiled, a small smile that twisted Violet's heart like a knife. She turned away into the shadows, her apron brushing her legs, the pouch at her side, empty now. Her weapon already unleashed, the choice already made, and though her body moved calmly, her soul was not calm. Her soul trembled with the weight of what she had done and what she might yet become. The hours after the feast bled into night, and the Larue mansion that had been filled with music and laughter began to tremble under a new sound. At first it was only a cough from the far end of the table, a general clutching his chest as if the wine had soured. Then another senator bent forward, groaning, his fork clattering against the silver plate. Laughter turned to murmurs. Murmurs turned to gasps, and in the glow of 100 candles, the banquet began to unravel one by one. The powerful men who had raised their glasses, so high bent, double their hands pressed to their bellies, their faces pale with terror. The floor shook with the scrape of chairs as guests staggered back, clutching their throats. Cries split the hall as bodies collapsed on polished wood rings, clattering necklaces, snapping wine spilling across embroidered cloth like rivers of blood. The air filled with the stench of sweat and vomit and fear, and the chandeliers above swayed, as though even the light recoiled from what was happening. The proud house of Larue, the symbol of power, wealth, and cruelty, had become a theater of screams. Madame Larue, the mistress, whose hands had scarred Violet's flesh, whose tongue had cut like iron, stood at first in fury, demanding order, calling for her servants. But her voice cracked with panic as her body betrayed her. She reached for the table, her glass falling to the floor. Her face flushed, her throat tight. She gasped a shrill cry that turned to a rasp. Her jeweled hands clawed at her neck as if she could tear the poison from inside her. She stumbled across the hall, knocking over plates, candles crashing to the ground, wax and fire spilling. She fell with a scream that split the air, then silence as her body twisted on the ground. Her eyes wide with the terror she had sown in others now returned upon her. The mansion was no longer a hall of celebration. It was a house of death. The proud senators writhing on the floor, their wives shrieking, their jewels clattering to the boards, the servants scattering in fear, some hiding behind curtains, others fleeing into the night. Doctors were called in desperation, their bags rattling with vials and knives, but they came too late. The poison had already made its home in the blood of every man and woman who had sat at that table, and through it all, Violet stood in the shadows, her body still, her breath steady, her eyes watching with the cold fire of vengeance fulfilled. She saw the men who had traded flesh for gold collapse. She saw the women who had laughed at the tears of the enslaved claw at the floor. She saw Madame Leroux's mouth open in one final gasp before stillness took her. Violet's lips did not smile. Her face did not change, but inside her chest, something long buried began to rise. Yet even as the chaos consumed the hall, Violet felt a shiver race down her spine. She had thought herself unseen, a shadow in the corner of the room. But then she felt it, a gaze piercing through the madness. Her eyes lifted and met another across the storm of bodies, one man still on his feet, though bent, coughing, his face pale, his lips streaked with blood, his hands shaking. He clutched the table to keep from falling, and yet his eyes were fixed on Violet. The world seemed to narrow around them, the screams fading, the thrashing bodies blurring until there was only his gaze and hers. His mouth opened, but no words came, only a wet, choking sound. His finger trembled, lifting as if to point, his body quivering with the effort. Violet's chest tightened, her hand pressing to her apron as though she could still hide the crime already done for a breathless moment. Violet thought the world had ended, that her shadowed calm had been pierced, that her vengeance had been seen, but the man's strength failed him. His arm dropped, his knees buckled. He collapsed forward onto the table, the plates rattling with the weight of his fall, his face hidden in the pool of spilled wine, his eyes gone dark. Violet drew in a long, slow breath, her fingers still against her apron, her eyes drifting back to the sea of bodies writhing. And still the storm she had unleashed had reached its peak, and yet the memory of that gaze burned in her mind. The image of a dying man who had seen her through the darkness, whose eyes had locked with hers, as if carrying her secret with him into death. And Violet knew then that though the hall was filled with the screams of the dying, though the mistress lay broken on the floor, though vengeance had tasted sweet for one night, the shadow of that gaze would follow her. It would haunt her steps. It would whisper in her dreams. It would remind her that vengeance does not end with death. It lingers in the living, in memory and silence, in the eyes of those who see. The night sky above New Orleans hung heavy and wet with the weight of storm clouds as Violet and Jacob slipped away from the burning chaos of the Leroux mansion, their feet carrying them through alleys and dirt roads, hearts pounding, yet bodies calm, as though the fire of vengeance had burned away fear behind them. The music of the ball had been replaced with screams, then silence, then the ringing cries of bells, summoning doctors, soldiers, priests. But Violet did not look back. Her hands, still, smelled of smoke and herbs, her apron heavy with shadows. Jacob walked beside her, his eyes sharp, scanning every corner, every step, the two of them moving like hunted animals that knew the world had already turned its gaze upon them. They left the city lights behind, crossing into the low marshlands where the cypress trees stood like watchmen and the ground swallowed sound. The swamp air wrapped around them, hot, thick, alive with insects, and the cries of frogs. Water lapped at their ankles as they waded deeper into the wilderness where no master dared to follow. Violet lifted her skirt above the muck. her face set like stone. Jacob pushed branches aside, the moonlight cutting through the leaves, painting them silver. The marsh became their shield, their prison, their sanctuary. By dawn, the city had woken to horror. The LaRue mansion stood silent, filled with bodies, the richest and most powerful men and women of Louisiana struck down by unseen hands. Whispers spread faster than fire. In a dry cane field poison they murmured evil work, cursed work, and beneath those whispers came the harsher voices of power. Vengeance against vengeance, men rode into the streets with muskets. Their faces pale, yet hard orders rang out, and soon the city walls were plastered with broad sheets printed in haste. The ink, still wet, wanted 2 runaway slaves, suspected murderers, Violet and Jacob, their names written in sharp black letters, their descriptions scrawled, faces imagined in rough sketches. Violet young, sharp eyes, skin dark as the river. Jacob tall, broad shoulders, strong hands together, accused of bringing death into the house of LaRue, accused of striking down senators, generals, merchants, slave traders, accused of turning a feast into a grave. Every tavern, every corner, every market stall bore the papers. Women whispered the names. Men spat curses. Children pointed to the drawings. Wide-eyed bounty was promised. Silver coin for capture, alive or dead, and already men hungry for blood, and money saddled their horses, strapped pistols to their belts, and began the hunt in the kitchen of the ruined mansion. A bounty hunter bent low, his fingers brushing the soot and shards left behind. His name was Carver, his face marked by scars from battles long past. He had the patience of a hound and the cruelty of a wolf. He searched where others only glanced, and in the ashes by the stove he found a trace. A faint dust, green and fine, clinging to the cracks of the floorboards. He lifted it with the tip of his knife, tasted it against his tongue, and smiled a slow, dark smile. Crushed roots, he muttered. Swamp poison, the whispers of slaves made true, and in his smile there was the promise of pursuit. Violet and Jacob knew nothing yet of Carver's discovery, but the marsh seemed to shift around them with the weight of unseen eyes. Every rustle in the reeds, every ripple on the water carried the echo of pursuit. Violet kept her pouch close, though it was nearly empty, her fingers brushing the fabric as if the last grains of powder held not only power but memory. Jacob walked ahead, his jaw set, his hand gripping the knife he had stolen from the coach house. Together they carved a path deeper into the swamp where the moss hung low and the ground swallowed footprints. But the city would not forget. The city would not forgive. The LaRue name had fallen. The blood of the powerful cried out, and Violet and Jacob were no longer shadows in a kitchen. They were marked. They were hunted. They were the storm that the masters feared, and the storm that now men like Carver would chase into the deepest corners of Louisiana. And Violet knew, though she did not speak it, that vengeance had given her wings for one night, but now it had chained her forever. Some say Violet was caught the very same week her body dragged back from the marsh, her wrists bound with iron chains, her eyes staring defiant, even as men shouted curses in the square. Some say she was hanged before a crowd in Congo Square, where the drums beat low and the people whispered her name, afraid yet proud. They say the rope snapped once before the second knot took her life. They say her spirit rose on the smoke and the song of the drums carried her into legend. Others whisper that Violet was never caught. They say she slipped past the hunters, past Carver and his hounds, crossing the Gulf on a ship bound for Haiti, where poisoners were not slaves, but warriors, women of fire and shadow who carried roots and powders. Like weapons, they say she was welcomed there as a sister, as a queen. They say she lived long, her hands still mixing herbs, her voice teaching others that food could kill as well as heal. They say she died an old woman, her eyes still sharp, her name spoken in hushed awe. Among the enslaved of Louisiana, Violet became more than flesh. She became a story whispered over fires told in the quarters at night when the children huddled close and the elders spoke of freedom. They told of the kitchen slave, who fed death to her masters, the woman who turned the tools of her bondage into the weapons of her revenge. Her name was spoken like a charm. Violet, Violet, Violet. The masters feared her memory. They warned their children not to speak her name. They burned her story from their ledgers. Yet still it grew. The enslaved carried it like an ember, hidden in cloth passed from mouth to mouth, across fields, across parishes, across time. Violet was no longer a girl in chains. She was a flame that refused to die, but some say her vengeance never left New Orleans. Even decades later, families swore their kitchens were haunted by her presence. They told of nights when the aroma of stew filled the halls. Though no pot simmered on the fire, a sweetness that lingered in the air, sharp and warm, with a bitterness that curled at the edge of the tongue. They said it was Violet's stew, the scent of vengeance carried through walls, through years, through blood. They said she returned to remind them that death once sat at their tables ladled by the hands they had sought to break. And in that haunting her legend grew, for whether hanged in the square or crowned in Haiti, Violet had become eternal, her spirit woven into every whisper of revolt, every kitchen where the enslaved stirred pots and dreamed of freedom every night. When the wind carried the scent of herbs through the streets of New Orleans, some say Violet was caught. Some say she was free, but all agree her name was never forgotten. Violet, the kitchen slave who fed death to her masters, Violet, whose vengeance lingered sweet and bitter in the breath of the city forever.